compatriots, Margaret, Steve. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming tonight. Helen Nearing has lots of fans, I can see. Tonight, Helen Nearing will tell us about Cuba. We have all heard about Cuba. Ron told us about Cuba. Remember, right around the time he was telling us about the evil empire, Russia? George told us about Cuba. And also about what a good guy for democracy that guy Noriega was down in Panama. And Bill, he's telling us about Cuba. Ever since that Cuban mafioso in Miami gave him $287,000 for his presidential run. But tonight, we're going to hear about Cuba from a whole different viewpoint. From a person who knows the good life when she sees it. She won't give us a cover-up story, and the Let Cuba Live committee is certainly not giving her $287,000 to spout the party line. The Let Cuba Live committee was founded in 1992. Our first speaker tonight was in on that founding. Steve Burke of Warren, Maine, was also the first Let Cuba Live member to answer the call from Pastors for Peace to join the caravan from cities all across the United States that first broke the blockade and crossed the border in Laredo, Texas, on its way to Cuba with humanitarian aid. Steve Burke was fired up before visiting Cuba, but the fire got hotter and brighter after that memorable trip. He is a tireless worker for fair treatment for Cuba. Here to tell you about Let Cuba Live is Steve Burke.
Thank you, Don. I'm all fired up. I've been asked to say a few words about Let Cuba Live and my involvement in that group and in Cuba work in general. Straight out, I have to tell you in the beginning that the main goal of Let Cuba Live is to bring down the embargo. We're up against some powerful opposition in Washington, led by Senator Jesse Helms and Robert Torricelli. In Miami, we're also up against some stiff opposition led by the extreme right wing of the Cuban-American community, the Miami-istas. They're a minority in their own community, by the way. They're also called the Gusanos, and they're also called the Cuban Mafia, and they don't play by the Marquis of Queensberry rules. They're not averse at all to using direct violence against people who oppose them or death threats. So we've kind of got our work cut out for us. Every time we try to raise the idea of getting rid of the blockade, there's this horrible cry of rage from Miami, and there's a horrible cry of rage from the conservatives in Washington, and it would be almost as if we had suggested something really radical, perhaps a leftist plot of some kind, perhaps something as dark and as innocuous as supporting sex education in the schools. I think they really see us as some kind of a threat. But why Cuba? People are hurting in the USA. People ask us all the time, why should we care so much about Cuba? People are hurting in this country. They're hurting from the East Coast to the West Coast, to the coal mining country of West Virginia, the grain belt in the Midwest, the inner cities. things are really bad in the U.S. and people are hurting. Entire segments of our population have been left behind by the American dream. Thousands of people fall through the safety net. The safety net's gone, but thousands of people slip into poverty every week, and it's getting worse. So people are hurting in the United States. If we don't do something soon about a complex set of socioeconomic, environmental problems, if we don't begin to address the root causes of these problems, we're going to find ourselves perched on the end of on the edge of an abyss. So I fear for my country. I do, and people are hurting in the United States, but in Cuba, people are being hurt, and they're being hurt with your tax dollars, with my tax dollars. They're being hurt by U.S. policy. They're being hurt by Bill Clinton, Robert Torricelli, and Jesse Helms, and these men are trying to bring the Cubans to their knees. They want them to assume the position. After going to Cuba, I can promise to you that the Cubans have no intention of assuming the position. I think they're going to carry on. So for myself, anyway, in order for me to get a good night's sleep and look in the mirror when I shave, and for me to live with myself, I have to do something from time to time to undo some of the damage that's being done in my name with my tax dollars, and that's why I'm involved in all of this. And if you find this policy a little bit archaic, if you find the Cuban embargo unpleasant, after hearing what you hear tonight, if you find it mean-spirited, if you find it cruel, if you find it a policy whose time to put it to rest, we can do that. We can change the laws. That's what it's all about. If we work together, we can change these laws. If we work together, and if we work together, we can bring down the U.S. blockade against Cuba. Thank you, and venceremos. We shall win.
Thank you, Steve. Steve is also our T-shirt and bumper sticker printer. Ample supplies of which are available tonight. I'd like to take this time also to call attention to the banners on either side, and we're appreciative of the solidarity that they thus express from the Veterans for Peace, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Maine Project on South Africa. They are here in solidarity. It is a cause that really involves it touches all of us, actually. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a petition circulating that we hope you will all sign, asking for our government to amend its policy on Cuba. We promise you that if you sign that petition, your name will not be taken for our mailing list. We have another clipboard, our mailing list clipboard, clearly identified as such, and we hope you will all want to sign that one as well. Thank you very much. Our next speaker has won the admiration of our committee as well as that of our principal speaker. Helen was admiring of the pile of wood he split for her yesterday. But our committee is admiring of his command of political history, especially when it comes to how the U.S. deals with its neighbors to the south. Michael grew up politically correct, a draft resistor of the Vietnam War. He was a driver in our second blockade-breaking caravan in July of last year. And he was jailed in Houston, Texas, when he returned from Cuba and protested the continued holding of a little yellow school bus. Here to touch on the high spots of U.S. piracy in Central and South America is Michael Canny of Alfred, Maine.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to talk also, as Steve did, about some of the misconceptions about Cuba that we all have, because for 35 years we've been told lies over and over and over again about Cuba, and many people that I know just repeat these ideas because they don't have any other source of information besides the blockade against Cuba. There's an information blockade against us. We're not allowed to travel to Cuba. It's against the law. We're the only country in the world that I know of whose citizens are refused the right to travel to Cuba. 20% of the Cuban tourist trade today is from Canada. And they don't go there for political reasons. They go there because it's a beautiful place and there's no crime problem and they have wonderful vacations there. And I think people here should have the same right. But I wanted to go over what some of these are, if you'll bear with me. I won't take too long. Fidel Castro, that's the first one. You know, we've always had this thing about enemies being chosen for us according to the needs of either the oil companies or whoever had some action that needed to happen around the world. And Noriega was the enemy of the month for a little while because they wanted to cut off the Panama Canal Treaty and go in and establish a more compliant government. And you know, never mind that drug running and money laundering in Panama has doubled since Noriega was taken out. Saddam Hussein was another evil tyrant. Well, Fidel Castro is the longest running one that we have. He's still public enemy number one. George Mitchell agrees with Jesse Helms on this. You know, there's a consensus in Washington, and I can't figure out why, but Fidel Castro is supposed to be a dictator and an evil tyrant who's feared and despised by his own people. This is the image. He has to step down before we can even talk to Cuba. I think it's interesting that the embargo against Vietnam is over with, and the embargo against Cuba is still in place. You know, there's something really strange about this policy. But speaking of Fidel Castro, anyone who's been to Cuba can tell you that this is one of the biggest lies of all, that Fidel Castro is unpopular in Cuba. Whatever you might think of him, I can tell you one thing, the people of Cuba defend him up and down, and people that even who criticize the bureaucracy of the government, people who have criticisms of their economic policies. When you talk about Fidel, it's like, hey, don't touch him. You know, he's with us, he's ours. And so this policy of attacking Fidel Castro as if they're doing it on behalf of the Cuban people is the biggest joke, the biggest hoax that's been perpetrated about Cuba. Because if you go there, you'll find out, well, in the elections, which I'll talk about in a second, their support for him was demonstrated. Yeah, they do have elections in Cuba. Human rights is another one, a big one. The human rights violations now. This gangster in Miami that Steve spoke of, who's the head of the Cuban American National Foundation, which is a CIA front, and which is given money from the National Endowment for Democracy, which they helped to create. Taxpayers' money goes into this group, and then they give the money to politicians to keep the embargo in place against Cuba. It's a pretty good racket. But Jorge Mascanosa has said that Fidel Castro is the Hemispheres' worst human rights violator. So I guess we know what he thinks of the genocide in Central America, 75,000 people being killed in El Salvador in the 80s and in Guatemala and all of the other countries that have had human rights problems. I mean, anybody doesn't have to be a history expert to know what goes on in a lot of these countries as far as human rights. And in Cuba, there's been no persecution of religious people. There's been no detention without charges. There's been no torture. Anything that's been documented. There have been individual cases that have been investigated that have been punished. There's been no policy on any of these things. Now, if you look at who the biggest recipients of U.S. aid are in Latin America, I think you'll find among that list the biggest violators of human rights by anyone's standards. But in Cuba, we are supposed to keep this embargo in place because of their human rights violations, because there might be a couple of hundred people in jail there who oppose the government. Never mind that some of them were caught with crates full of grenades and bazookas and weapons that they intended to attack people in Cuba with. But they're political prisoners because they're opposing Castro. So I think we need to apply the same standards. I'm not saying there's no human rights violations in Cuba. What I'm saying is that anyone who investigates it objectively and uses the same criteria on Cuba that we use on El Salvador, on Guatemala, on Honduras, on Mexico, our big trading partner now, where there have been 150 political executions, disappearances in the last several years of people, of union activists, of student activists. You know, Mexico is not a human rights paradise. And, you know, I think if we're going to start using these criteria to say who we're going to be friends with, who we're going to trade with, then we should use the same ones with everybody. And I think Cuba would come out looking real good if that was the case. Now the elections, I wanted to talk a little bit about elections because I think to talk about elections in Cuba draws a blank with most people in this country. They've been told there's no such thing as elections in Cuba. And it's not just elections. Democracy in Cuba is not viewed as just an election that whoever has the most money to spend and the best access to the media and the prettiest face is going to get elected. I mean, they've got a radical idea in Cuba about democracy and about elections. They view the U.S. model for democracy as a miserable failure in the countries where it's been implemented. And if you look at places like El Salvador or Haiti or any of the other places where this country's had such an influence over the last 35 years, I can see why Cubans might not want to adopt the system that this country is proposing over their own. But one of their radical ideas is that money shouldn't have anything to do with the electoral process. And what they're trying to do in Cuba is they're trying to establish a grassroots consensus building process so that the candidates that are proposed to represent the people really represent the people. So that there's a consensus that this person represents the constituency that they're supposed to represent before they even get nominated. So the debates go on and the consensus building goes on, but when somebody is nominated, there's a majority of people already behind him or her. So in the elections that just took place recently, this is probably all stuff that very few people in this room knew about. Not recently, I'm sorry, it was a year ago. They had their elections for the National Assembly, and they invited the international press to come. Now, nobody came from this country. Nobody covered. The international press was invited to cover the entire election, freedom to move about, interview citizens. The press was invited to monitor the public vote counting at every polling place in Cuba. The international agencies monitoring elections declared that the vote was free and fair without exception. There was no charge of fraud, there was no charge of ballot tampering, there was no charge from any place. There was no reporting on it here, so we couldn't. The voter turnout was 99.62% of the population, with 92.97% of the votes being valid. So I'd say that's a pretty good turnout. Now, what happened is there was a big propaganda war the weeks before the election from Miami, telling people, deface your ballots, don't vote, tell the world that you're oppressed, that you don't want this government, that you don't want the revolution. And so a couple of weeks before the election, Fidel Castro wrote a letter and published it and said, I'm asking the people to vote for they could vote up or down for each candidate. They don't have to vote for the whole slate. They can vote against any candidate, and the candidate that doesn't get 50% of the votes is out. But the vote of confidence in the whole slate, which was a vote of confidence in the leadership, was 88.5% of the votes cast said yes to all of the delegates to the National Assembly. Now, the new National Assembly serves a 5-year term, and it elected the Council of State, Fidel Castro, who was elected unanimously. He's the dictator, but he's being elected the same way as the Electoral College works, by the way. You know, he's being elected by delegates that were all elected by the total body of the population. In his precinct, he got 99% of the vote, because he's running also as a delegate. Now, 83% of the delegates are newcomers. The average age is 43. Now, I think maybe the Cubans have some ideas about participatory democracy and grassroots democracy that should be looked into. Now, it's true they only have one party, but I think anybody who voted in the last election who feels the way I do about a lot of things might think that there's more diversity within their party than there is between the two that we have to choose from. I mean, on the issue of Cuba, for one thing, I can tell you that there's not a shred of difference between Bill Clinton and George Bush or George Mitchell and Jesse Helms. And I think that before we condemn their system, we should look at it a little closer, because there's a hypocrisy going on when we say the reason for our hostility, the reason we're helping to squeeze children and old people and sick people in Cuba economically And the reason we're supporting this policy is for their benefit, is because we want them to be free from their system. I think we need to go and ask them, because there's nobody in Cuba that supports the U.S. policy. There's nobody in Cuba that supports the blockade. And that's some things I wanted to say about some of the misconceptions and lies that we've been, I mean, I think anyone who thinks that there's anything to what the government says about Cuba should look into it a little closer and see for themselves, because it's not a perfect place. It's an experiment. And I'd say it's a bold experiment, because what interests me about Cuba is the only place in the world today where you have people who are actually so idealistic that they think they can build a society that's not based on greed. I mean, this is something that's still alive in Cuba. You go to Cuba today, people have nothing. They're paid. You can't buy anything with the money. You know, everything is rationed. Everything is tight. And yet, everybody has smiles on their faces. The kids are all happy in the streets. There's no worry about walking through the poorest areas of Havana. They're telling me that there's some areas that at night things are starting to get worse because the economic squeeze is on. But it's a place, it doesn't look like the kind of place that's described here. And I think these lies go back a long ways too. You know, it's not just Fidel Castro, it's not just communism in Cuba, because this is something we have to understand. The United States has staked out ownership of Cuba since in the 1850s, when Spain was the owner of Cuba. The U.S. government offered Spain $100 million to buy Cuba, and they turned them down. They said, no, we're going to hang on for a while. And then there was an insurrection in Cuba in 1868, and for 10 years the Cuban people fought. Tens of thousands of Cubans died. 80,000 Spanish soldiers died on Cuban soil trying to put down the insurrection, which they succeeded in doing after 10 years. But the history in Cuba of the struggle goes a long ways. When you talk to people there, they don't just talk about Fidel Castro, they talk about what happened in the 1860s. They talk about what happened in 1897 when 250,000 Cubans died of starvation in concentration camps that were set up by the Spanish. And this was part of the pretext here for, you know, remember the battleship Maine? Does anybody remember battleship Maine in Havana Harbor? That was the Reichstag fire of Havana. That was the first sort of big lie that was told. We need to go in and save the Cuban people from these horrible Spanish tyrants. Well, imagine the dismay of the Cuban forces, the patriotic forces that have been fighting and bleeding against the Spanish when they found out that the U.S. didn't want to save them from the Spanish. They wanted to take their place. Of course, things were done more nicely after that, but it was still one colonizer taking the place of another one. And it was natural because 70% of the Cuban economy was controlled by the United States by that time, by the turn of the century. So, you know, this has been going on. Cuba is an escaped slave. You know, it's someone who stood up and said, I don't want to be your slave anymore. That's the real crime Cuba has committed. And I think that those of us who think there's problems in Cuba should look closer at it and examine the source of our information and try to go there, because we have information here on how to go to Cuba, and I would recommend it to anybody who can afford to do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Michael was inspired while he was in Cuba by the need for wheelchairs there. He has organized our campaign and will provide most of the logistics for getting the wheelchairs to Key West and then on to Cuba. There's a donation bucket and a wheelchair in the rear of the church in case you missed it. Thank you very much. Congressman Tom Andrews, who was invited, unfortunately he's on the campaign trail and he's not able to make it tonight, advises that he cannot make our meeting tonight, but he sends the following statement. It's addressed to one of our members, Stan Lofsche. Dear Stan, I'm sorry I can't be with you today. As you know, I share your goal of lifting the trade embargo between the United States and Cuba. And I am a co-sponsor of H.R. 2229, the Free Trade with Cuba Act, which lifts the trade embargo and provides a step in the direction of a new and open dialogue with Cuba. At issue is whether our nation is going to look to the future or be mired in the Cold War politics of the past. Whatever justification there may have been for the trade embargo, it has clearly failed. Now the United States has the opportunity to usher in a new relationship with Cuba as it prepares for its future. Lifting the embargo allows us to take an important positive step in this direction. It is a step that will benefit not only the people of Cuba, but American citizens as well. The Bangor International Airport offers an excellent example. Maine loses thousands of dollars of economic opportunity every day because planes from Europe heading to Cuba and other destinations in Latin and South America are required to refuel at airports in Canada. Why? Because of provisions in the trade embargo of Cuba. In short, the embargo is a lose-lose proposition for Cubans who are looking to the future and a new era for their nation, and for Mainers who are seeking to create new opportunities and jobs for our future. I again regret I am unable to join you this evening. I would have liked to have heard Helen Nearing, whom I have admired for some time. She probably doesn't remember, but I met her a few years back in Blue Hill. I would like to wish her and everyone else present today the very best with the forum. And maybe it's not too late to wish Helen a happy birthday. She just had her 90th birthday. The Wrangel bill, is which the bill that Tom Andrews refers to, is one possible way out of the straitjacket our government insists upon for Cuba. Please call Tom's office with support for his efforts. Tom Andrews has repeatedly answered the call for fairness. We have been very fortunate to attract good people to our cause. Our most recent catch must be credited to our travel office. That's right. Would you mind standing that poster up there? This winter, we opened a travel office in Brunswick at the home of Stan and Luki Lofchi, and ran ads in the Maine Times and the Casco Bay Weekly. Perhaps you saw the ads. By the way, Stan and Luki will be minding their travel table in the Parish House after the program tonight. Stan and Luki have also been tending to the literature tables where a wealth of information not available on your newsstands awaits you. The literature table will be in service in the rear of the church after the program as well. Mark Tully and Daniel Gottlieb, both alumnus of the College of the Atlantic at Bar Harbor, saw our travel ads and they called. They were interested in the vacation. No doubt they pictured sand, sun, surf. Well, they vacationed in Cuba, all right, but probably differently than they had originally planned. Co-drivers in our third caravan, they saw a lot of the pro-Cuban United States on the way to breaking the blockade in Laredo, Texas. Daniel Gottlieb is not able to join us tonight. He is in New York where he is consolidating the film and video footage he brought back from his trip. We hope to show his video when it is completed. Mark is with us tonight, and I will ask him to make a few remarks about their experience before our next event, which will be the video presentation of highlights of the 3 caravans which have successfully broken the Cuban blockade. Mark Tully, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Mark Tully from Bar Harbor. Actually, if anybody's from up that way, I'd appreciate a ride later on tonight, but that's inconsequential. We had the kickoff rally here in Portland on February 20th, around there, and just headed down, stopping at city to city and meeting all these folks and having press conferences and rallies and talks and discussions. And once we started to get down south, arguments about this stuff and these issues. And I was amazed at the diversity of folk who were driven to go on the caravan and the diversity of reasons they were there. Pretty much right across the board. There were 13 such caravans that came down through the United States, some starting in Canada, and picking up people and aid and doing all these things city to city all the way down through this time. And when we converged in Laredo, Texas, there were 250 of us and 70 vehicles and somewhere between 115 to 140 tons of humanitarian aid, which was made up of medicines and bicycles and powdered milk and some technology too, which I'll get to in a second. But we had this action at the border in Laredo, and somebody had mentioned the little yellow school bus earlier, which was prevented on the second friendshipment from crossing the border, apparently, from what I hear, because the excuse was given that it would be used for military purposes, and so it couldn't go. But a hunger strike was held, and eventually the pressure got to be such that the government released it. This time we brought 7 yellow school buses and a handicap access bus, city bus from LA, and an ambulance over, and we figured that that would get across because that issue had already been dealt with, you know, on the last friendshipment. So to up the ante a bit, somebody had donated a large satellite dish, and so that was like the lead thing that headed on up to the border at Laredo. And within a couple hours, the State Department, the State Department, Treasury Department, Defense Department, National Security Council, and the White House staff were all having separate discussions about whether this satellite dish could be allowed to go into Mexico bound for Cuba. And everything else was let through. At first they had confiscated some special cancer medicine for children, but they were sort of shamed into releasing that and releasing medicine that had been seized on the last friendshipment as well, which is due to the amazing negotiating power of the Reverend Lucius Walker, who heads up Pastors for Peace. And along with the satellite dish, however, they confiscated a lot of other technological items, an eye examination table that had been donated, and computers, and some typewriters, and a toaster. That was Fidel's favorite part of the story, when we told him that. And then the next day the word came down from the White House that none of that stuff could go. And the group decided to just leave that stuff at the office, go and do the program in Cuba, and handle it when we got back. Our time in Cuba was amazing. I won't even begin because I could just go off forever, and I will get lost if I try. So when we got back from Cuba, we crossed back into Texas and reassembled the satellite dish and took all the boxes with the computers and such and the toaster and prepared to carry those boxes across and drove the satellite dish back up to the border. And apparently we took them by surprise because whoever was at the border just waved it on through, you know, which I wish I could have seen the Reverend Lucius Walker's face when that happened, because we were expecting it. You know, we were ready for a civil disobedience action, and those of us with the boxes were allowed to just walk them straight across the bridge. And so we were kind of in shock, you know, but very elated nonetheless. And about an hour and a half, 2 hours into it, somebody in the border folk realized that, you know, they had just messed up really, really bad because they had just, you know, disobeyed a direct order from the White House. And so the border was flooded with police, and the last 3 boxes were detained briefly. The 2 that had medicine in it that had recently been donated were confiscated. I had one of the boxes, but it was only, once they forced me to open it, it was only pant zippers, and they didn't feel like making an issue, so they let me go across. But and there was a truck. Only one vehicle had been turned around originally, and that was a small box truck that had a spare engine in it, and that had been sent back to the compound where we were staying. Now, Lucius went back and got that. Him and a man named Camilo drove it up to the border, but by this time, all the police were there, so the police tried to seize the truck. and they stayed in. Camilo and Lucius were forcibly removed from the truck such that they required hospital treatment later on in the day, especially Camilo. And they were charged, Lucius was charged with assaulting a federal officer. We have no idea where that came from, but they seized the truck and rolled it away, and they have charges. So the thing is that, and the United States government started putting immense amounts of pressure on the Mexican government not to release the satellite dish out of customs. It may be in this video, but that satellite dish, which was big, was on the back of this truck, and it was huge, it was towering. When it pulled up, and the woman who was in charge of press, you know, at the border said that they had lowered it down in the truck. I mean, if you could just see this picture, and snuck it across the border with this big rally going, Cuba, you know. But I guess the main point is all this stuff got across, and about a week after that event, the Mexican government, who was certainly embroiled in its own troubles at the time, released the satellite dish. It is now sitting on top of the Martin Luther King Center in Havana, communicating with churches and solidarity organizations in the United States. So the next caravan's in October and November, and you know, start fundraising for it now because it's something you should do. And that's all I got. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Mark. We're going to show a video now. We will see Lucius Walker, and he is a very powerful figure, you see, certainly, very articulate. It's going to be divided. There's going to be cuts from three separate occasions. The first sequence comes from Dan Gottlieb, the co-driver of Mark's. It's from the tape that he's still working on right now in New York City, en route to Cuba, just received. And the next, entitled The Little Yellow School Bus, is from 1993, and the last and longest is from 1992, involved breaking the blockade. So we're going to set up a screen, and we'll have it for you in just a minute.
Is it possible to hear Helen Nearing? We came here specifically for that because we admire her greatly. And if you could,
Yes, I understand your concern. Yes, we will have her. Helen is a very integral part of this program, and it's about Cuba, and yes, we consider this to be a good background, and it won't take long.
but we came specifically because of her, and there was no mention of these other speeches.
Did you receive a program when you came in?
No. Yes, when we came in.
Oh, okay, well,
We saw notice at the university.
okay, well, we're wasting time, so we're going to we'll set up, and we'll get over as quickly as possible, and then our main speaker will be here very shortly. Thank you.
We've come over a long journey to be here. That journey has been a journey of at least more than 30 years. We come from more than 25 states. masters and lay people, old and young. We are people of book. One of the most revolutionary documents I know. If we truly live by the faith that is in this book, it would be the greatest revolutionaries in the world. So there is no contradiction between faith and revolution.
I'm also making pictures, I've been meeting with you. Because I have been following very closely that great deed that you have performed. I really wanted to be able to express to you directly our great appreciation for what you have done. I think that very few things we are so courageous have ever been performed. The Bible has not been written yet, and your writing conversation is that way. Because there are things that have been happening in the course of years. And sometimes people are not aware of what it really means. Well, it's okay, as we call it. Really means there is an enormous injustice. It really jeopardized the development of our country. It really prevented our access to technology. It prevented our access to any kind of trade from the international financial institutions. But also the goods which are sold in the rest of the world were inaccessible. The foodstuffs were inaccessible, and the medicines were inaccessible to you. What is happening to us has an importance. It is because it is happening to any country of the world. Maybe to any country of the third world. That's why your battle, as we waging now, Cuba, is the battle that you are waging for the third world. It's a battle you are waging for all nations. For all nations that have been located in the country because they were colonies. They were exploited. They were enslaved. We shall be able to say one day to the world, the United States is powerful, because it has a powerful people, and because it has a strong people.
I don't know this town, how much love, how much genuine commitment you have among yourselves, and you put all that together.
We're about ready for the main event. However, I do think that the film provided some local color. Hopefully it set the mood for a visit to Cuba. Our guest speaker tonight, Helen Nearing, has just returned from Cuba, and in a few moments she's going to share her thoughts on that subject. I just want to call your attention to a film that's being premiered on Thursday, April 21st at the State Theater in Portland, entitled Bafa. It's a movie set in South Africa, and it's a fundraising to support the Fund for Elections in South Africa. And I presume that our main project on Southern Africa is involved with this. Okay, fine. Okay. The main project on Southern Africa, and there's a representative down here, claims that he has tickets for this event if anyone would be interested in it. The tickets are $10. Okay, Michael Canny will now introduce Helen Nearing.
Yeah, thank you again for being so patient. This event tonight is important because Cuba has touched our lives. I know it's touched Helen's life. This is her second year that she's been to Cuba. And I'm planning to go back this month to visit Cuba again. And we wanted to share as much information as we could about it because there are so few sources of information out there on Cuba. And we're glad you stayed with us for it. I really don't know how to introduce Helen Nearing. I had the privilege and the honor of spending the night last night sleeping beside her wood stove, and every time I go up there, it's like a trip to a holy place for me because it's holy in two different spellings. There's just something whole about the world that she and Scott created up there that is missing from so many of our lives. And they've been at it for a long time. Helen and Scott spent 53 years together, and it's been over 10 years since Scott left us, and Helen has gone on living the good life and writing about it and sharing it and teaching it. And I just feel like there's so much that we can learn from Helen and from Scott, even though he's gone. He's left behind a lot of writings about society and civilization and economics that I think have yet to. It's a vein of treasure yet to be discovered, especially going into the period we're in today's world. He was kind of an original thinker, and I think he deserves some looking at today. But Helen, as Don mentioned, just turned 90. And she is just one of the elders that I feel deserves all of our admiration and respect. And I would like to let her say what she has to say instead of saying any more. But I thank everybody for coming tonight. And Helen, I think everybody's ready. Everybody's ready for you.
I take half such applause, more than half of it, for Scott. We were in this together, and he did more than half of all of it. He was by far the larger part. He should be here tonight, but I'm sure he's busy somewhere else productively and doing a good job. As a matter of fact, my first trip to Cuba was with him. I've been to Cuba 3 times, and each time primarily for the same reason. The U.S. forbids it. If they don't want me to go, I want to see what's there. The first time I went with Scott, and it was over 25 years ago, it was forbidden as now by the U.S. government. Our passports at that time read, "Not good for travel in Cuba, Albania, and China." We went to all 3. The same year, and lost our passports for so doing. They were canceled after a hearing in Washington. and we were confined for years within the U.S. borders. We were in good company. Paul Robeson and Corliss Lamont were also forbidden their passports. They took the issue to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court deemed that a passport is a right, not a privilege dispensed with by the Secretary of State. So we got our rights back. It is still clamped on Cuba. You can go to Albania now with the U.S. blessing, and you can go to China. Cuba is the only country which is not now allowed to go to by U.S. citizens. You can only go there on a peace mission with a peace brigade, or as a member of an environmental group, or as a news gatherer, as a reporter. I went with Promoting Enduring Peace, a peace group, twice, this year and last year in the spring. I went again to defy the U.S. restrictions and to see what's going on there and to show my support. Is what the U.S. doesn't want us to see so terrible? Is it a dangerous country? Are the people marching and demonstrating in the streets? Are they killing each other and visitors as they do in our cities? I saw no guns. I saw no frightening encounters such as I'm afraid of in New York City and in Chicago. There are no assassinations there as here. I've been at a huge gathering, an outdoor evening meeting in a park in Havana, where the audience was in complete darkness, a huge audience, and Castro was on a brilliantly lighted stage. I speak no Spanish and understand no Spanish, so I left Scott near the podium and I walked around through the crowd. I could have, or anybody could have taken a pot shot at Castro, but he's still there. JFK and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King have been killed in the U.S. Castro is still alive and kicking, very much kicking, and to the despair of the CIA and of Miami exiles. How come this man is still around? The people are proud of Fidel and what he has accomplished for them. He's mentioned with affection and respect. He is their George Washington, as Che Guevara is their Lafayette. Curiously enough, all through Havana and Santiago de Cuba, wherever I went, I saw no statues of Castro. I saw no streets named after him. I saw no T-shirts, such as the one I have of Che Guevara. There's not a mention in big public posters of Castro at all. He's keeping himself very much behind. He is not pushing himself. Is the country crumbling into decay, as reactionaries in the U.S. say? Is Havana a rundown ghost city? If it were, it would be largely due to the U.S. decision to strangle the revolution. From the days of Eisenhower, Cuba has been ostracized by the USA. It has been denied its legitimate rights as part of the world community. Eisenhower initiated the blockade against Cuba. The U.S. still aims to strangle the Cuban population economically by denying them the stuff of life. If the cities and the buildings and the homes are shabby, it is because the U.S. has not allowed an iota of free trade. Here is a list of what Cuba needs and what is denied. Machines, cars, bicycles, steel for construction, spare parts for cars and buses, new buses, inner tubes, tin plate for cans, sulfur for the nickel industry, cotton, polyester, rayon fibers, thread, cement, wheat, flour, and grains, edible oils and lard, soap, fertilizers, wood pulp for paper, household appliances, bicarbonate of soda, pencils, pens, papers for pads, many medical supplies. The U.S. could supply all these things to the benefit of U.S. business and for the Cuban population. For 30 years, the U.S. has refused relations with it, has boycotted trade from and to, and has even threatened its allies and subject countries to have nothing to do with Cuba. It has tried for years and still does so to strangle it and to eliminate it from the Brotherhood of Nations. For more than 30 years, the U.S. has banned and grounded the peoples of a small neighboring island by an infamous legislation initiated and fiercely propelled by a group of Miami-based Cuban exiles. The Cubans at home in their beautiful island are trying to carry on normally under very abnormal situations. They're a proud people, proud of their revolution and of their independence. They want only legitimate relations with the outside world. They want equal rights. They want and will pay for what they need. The U.S. now gives millions or billions of dollars in aid to reactionary governments in all parts of the globe, but none to revolutionary Cuba. Cuba does not ask for aid. It wants equal treatment and access to its needs. The U.S. not only refuses aid, it restricts all commerce by its allies and threatens and penalizes any country who trades with Cuba. Cuba wants to be able to export their own products, and the UN backs them in this. Only 4 countries voted in the UN against Cuba's appeal for rights and to lift the embargo. Those countries were the U.S., Albania, Paraguay, and Israel. How can Clinton call for democracy in Cuba when his own Cuban policy is determined by a bunch of reactionary exiles in Miami and by only a few subservient allies? What kind of democracy do they want to bring back to Cuba? Casinos, bordellos, drug dealers and gangsters? Do they want to make it an American colony? They already have a toehold in Guantanamo. Do they want it all? Do they want the whole island to become one of their banana republics? Where will this Cuba obsession end? Latin American countries look with sympathy on fellow sardines that the U.S. shark would happily swallow. The U.S. cracks the whip, and in the case of Cuba, they have no success. So they either invade, as they tried in the case of the Bay of Big Pigs, or they proclaim a Cold War, which now exists. Cuba continues to refuse to capitulate to the U.S., which bullies it and retains its hold on Cuban property in Guantanamo. U.S. domination in certain parts of Latin America is pretty well assured, but not in Cuba. The U.S. attempt to strangle and starve them is not bringing Cuba down. Why this mad obsession against Cuba? What is the U.S. afraid of? It's hardly dangerous to the U.S. It rivals us in nothing. The people are normal and cheery, going about their daily business. India is the saddest country I have ever been in. Cuba is the most cheerful, the warmest, the friendliest, the most resilient and strong. Incidentally, their life expectancy is more than 75 years, which maybe is one of the things that they do rival the United States. They have a wonderful climate. They have superb beaches. Would the U.S. like to exploit them? Would they like to have casinos there, gambling joints, gangsters, sell drugs? The people in Cuba don't want to lose the benefits of their revolution. I've taken down some things which the Cuban people said to me in public and in private. We have no hungry children or uneducated. We have no discrimination of color. All are equal. We have generous social security. We do not want to lose all that. We do not want capitalism to return to our country. We want to maintain our system and our dignity with no interference from outside. Cuba used to be Yankee-led. Now all the property is Cuban. It is our problem, it is our people problems that we all face. We must tackle them ourselves. These are things said by ordinary people. Here are two statements by Castro. We do not want to become a second Miami or Palm Beach with its ultra-rich and its second-class citizens. We want to progress in our own way. We want to buy dollars, not be bought by them. There is talk that now Castro is giving in, that he is allowing foreign investment, that dollars can now enter its country, that Cuba is turning to capitalism. But Castro says the Cubans will be owners of their own country. We are not going to abandon socialist measures. We are taking certain steps simply because we have no other choice, simply to preserve the socialist system. Here Castro ends with all the developments with the participation of foreign capital must be done under the direction of the revolutionary government and within the objectives of socialism. The Cubans will remain the owners of their own country. Their present concern is survival, economic, social, political, and cultural. If Cuba had not this hostility, if the illegal embargo to deal with it would be, without that, it would be striding ahead and providing all the needs of its people. Even so, even under the difficult conditions under which it is now laboring, Cuba has lifelong health care, cradle to grave, something we still do not have. It has free universal education up to the 9th grade. Its rents are very low. So far, they have no taxes. There are no ragged, wretched beggars in the streets. No one sleeping outside in the streets, as in U.S. cities. They have no very rich and no very poor. There are no really poverty-stricken people. They are low on many items, but they are not starving. There is scarcity, but no starvation. Let me tell you, the people in Cuba are still behind Castro and socialism. They do not want to lose the benefits of their revolution. True, there are long lines waiting for buses that the U.S. won't sell them. True, they need many necessities as well as many luxuries. True, there are lists of things they are deprived of due to the embargo. True, they ride bicycles instead of cars, but that's healthy, and it's a flat country, much like Holland or Denmark. And the Cubans condemn the U.S. government, not the people, for these lacks. With new dispensations, Cubans can now use dollars and can travel to the U.S. and back. Here is a heading in the Christian Science Monitor. Cubans visit the U.S. in droves, but most are happy to return. There's a full-page story here, November 12th, 1993. They speak of the exiles, not some of the exiles are sending their family back, but some Cubans are visiting the U.S. and come back wearing 3 pairs of pants, 3 dresses, a sweater, 2 dress jackets, Pinned to the inside hem of the dresses are 6 pairs of socks, a stuffed animal, and 2 handbags. Each wrist is encircled with 3 watches and several bracelets. Straw hats are covered with Christmas tree lights, a rubber snake, sunglasses, pens, cigarettes, keychains, a calculator, carriage, and gift boxes. I sat next to a girl returning from Miami to Cuba. She was so loaded she could hardly fit into the seat. I asked her if she would list for me what she was bringing over. Here is her list. 4 pouches to the waist, 2 pairs of pants, 3 pairs of socks, 1 backpack, one bag with a lantern, 1 jacket, 3 dozen pens, 3 dozen pencils, 3 markers, 100 envelopes, 4 pounds of garlic powder, 2 packages of cinnamon sticks, chewing gum. The little boys in the street, I met maybe a dozen during the whole time I was there, asked not for money but for chiclets. So she brought gum back, 100 candies, 12 lighters, 10 nail polishers, 1 nail polish remover, 3 card sets, etc., etc. And she gave me her name and address. So you see, this story from the Christian Science Monitor was right on the ball. The guards have seen this sight many times before. This is U.S. guards. Faced with a 44-pound baggage limit on the crowded daily charter flight to Havana, many returning Cubans transform themselves into walking department stores. For every front-page Cuban fighter pilot who defects, or every desperate Cuban who manages to cross the shark-infested waters on a raft to Florida, there are 10 times as many Cubans who come to the U.S. on tourist visas and go home again. Last year, 27,000 Cubans came to shop and visit relatives. United States Department officials say more than 90% go back. It's certainly more comfortable in the U.S., says Ramiro Garcia, an octogenarian on his way back from a visit with family in Miami, but the crime is horrible. Tourists are murdered, teenagers killing teenagers. In Havana, once every 3 months you hear about somebody being killed. In Miami, it's every day. It's a beautiful country, but you have old people begging in the street. Children are sold drugs in school. You don't see that in Cuba. He has no plans to leave Cuba permanently. So thousands may leave for Miami, but few stay permanently. Cuba has held firm so far, and after 3 visits there, I'm happy to report that Cuba holds fast in its social identity, and even in the last year I went, in 1993, when they were pretty well scraping bottom, I sensed a change for the better. Since then, instead of for the worse, it is on the up and up, I feel. South American countries are trading with and traveling there. French, German, Spanish, Dutch, Italians, and of course Canadian and Mexicans are there in droves to do business or just to enjoy. I don't wonder that the Miami exiles want Cuba back. It's one of the most beautiful countries and has one of the most beautiful beaches I have ever seen. Cuba will survive without U.S. help, but how much decenter it would be if Big Brother would help Little Brother and act decently. How cruel can one be? How spiteful? How unbrotherly? So I went to demonstrate brotherhood and caring and interest and helpfulness. I would go anywhere in the world I could to demonstrate that. And I went because the USA is so mean and has such a shameful policy. I recommend that each and all of you go there if at all possible, and see for yourselves if I'm not right. as to their good purpose, their idealism, and their strengths. Peace groups are going all the time. And try to get Congress to repeal the infamous Torricelli Act and lift the cruel embargo. We are the big sanctimonious bullies of the world. Let's be brothers and sisters toward the good life for the Cubans.
Will you take questions?
Yeah, sure. It seems as if Scott is here.
Helen Nearing says she'd be happy to take questions. We'll allow about a 15-minute period for questions.
But I'm not a statistician. I can only tell you what I feel, not there are other experts here that can answer them. Yes, I'll happily answer any question.
Have you ever talked to George Mitchell about why he doesn't support
Will you
breaking the
repeat them?
blockade?
She wants to know if you've ever talked to George Mitchell about why he doesn't support the notion of breaking the blockade.
Scott or I never have sought the big bugs. We've gone, I think we've gone to Russia 7 times. We never met any of the big personalities. We've been in China 3 times and again didn't seek out. We don't seek them out, and we prefer not to be sought out too. We're just, we're students of what's going on in the world, and we will go anywhere and help as we can, but we don't know any of these big personalities.
I'd like to say a word about that, just briefly. We have contacted, a lot of us have contacted all of our congressional representatives, and the only one who's responded is Tom Andrews. George Mitchell has written several replies saying that he doesn't support any change until the Cuban government changes, which is a precondition that we think is unacceptable. But his position is basically the same as everyone else in the administration.
Good, thank you. Help me when you can.
Another question? No?
None.
I just have a comment. When I was on a delegation to Nicaragua in 1987, and we went to the U.S. Embassy in Managua, I always remember the words of the U.S. ambassador, when Cuba belonged to us.
The words of the ambassador, United States ambassador in Nicaragua. He said, when Cuba belonged to us, the United States. Typical.
How they would love it.
Really? Yeah.
And I would never go to Cuba again if they take possession.
There's a question right over there.
I wondered if you could comment on whether it looked as though the children are becoming malnourished. We've heard something about blindness and vitamin deficiency. Is that evident?
She wants to know if the children appear to be undernourished or whether blindness seems to be a factor.
No, the people seemed really healthy and really well. We didn't get to hospitals, but we were on one of the beaches where the Chernobyl children are being taken care of. The Cuban government has invited over hundreds of Chernobyl deformed and diseased children with their mothers, and that we saw them there on the beaches. And they also are bright and merry and chirpy and seemed to look well. Some had lost their hair and there were some disabilities, but on the whole they were well and happy, and they wanted to stay. They didn't want to go back home.
They're treating them all free of charge.
They were invited with their mothers free of charge. Yes.
How long is the visa permit for to stay in Cuba?
How long?
How long is a visa permit for to stay in Cuba?
You can only get through with these groups. We were there 2 weeks at a time. I don't know of any allowed to stay longer.
3 weeks?
2 weeks at a time. Yes, ma'am.
I just returned from Cuba on April 4th with 2 other people here with me. We looked at the healthcare system. I was there in November, and I went back again in this month of March and into April. And 12, they're thin. They're not starving, but there really is hunger there. And I got more of that sense of hunger in April than I did even when we were there in November. In terms of the health care, they really do an excellent job. I've had a lot of travels in all of Latin America. I've looked at health care in many places, and health care in Cuba really is as good as they say. It's excellent. But again, they're hurting terribly. So I just wanted to say thank you for being here.
As I say, in India, I've been distressed with the people in the streets. In Cuba, I saw no one that I felt particularly sad that they were perishing or that they were starving. Never, not once.
Yes, sir.
I'm intrigued by your comment that when you really wanted to know, you did not seek the top people. I've always been intrigued by remembering Charles de Gaulle saying, "La France, c'est moi." So I would like to know if you can help us to understand.
What was that last sentence?
When you do want to go somewhere, and you do want to understand, whom do you seek out in order to really understand what's going on?
He mentioned the fact that you said you don't seek out the big bugs,
No.
but you really want to know. So who is it you seek out to really know? To
People
really
in the
find?
street. In Russia, Scott spoke Russian, Scott spoke Spanish. I spoke Dutch and German, so when we go around, we try to meet the people in the streets. In China, we had interpreters, but we don't avoid the big bugs, but we do go after the people in the street and talk with them, or talk in the factories or in the schools or the hospitals. I've seen some horrendous things going on in the Chinese hospitals, where with acupuncture, while a person was perfectly normally alive and eating a piece of tangerine, they operated on her heart, and I fainted. The patient didn't. I couldn't take it.
Yes, ma'am.
Does Canada have any industry in Cuba?
Does Canada
Have any industry in Cuba?
a statistic? I don't know. Interesting. I'll find out though, but I won't see you again.
When I was there recently, I did talk to a Canadian geologist who was there. He said that there were several joint ventures, and Canada was investigating possibilities of minerals and oil. So they're very interested in doing business in Cuba. I had one question about the use of the peso and the dollar now. And I don't know if anyone has an idea of what's going to happen with that. The people have pesos, but they can't buy anything with them.
That I didn't get. Would you tell me?
The dollars are very
And
scarce, and only a few
repeat the question as much for them as for me.
Right.
I'm not totally deaf.
She wonders about money in Cuba, that the people in Cuba have pesos, but they don't seem to be able to buy anything with pesos. I presume you mean that the dollar is more and more required?
Well, they use both pesos and dollars now. Last year when I was there in 1993, they could only use pesos, but now they can use, you see them in the dollar stores. But to my mind, the things in the dollar stores are not worth buying. I mean, it's just regular American goods. It's like a department store, which is not for me.
Yes, sir?
He's going to say something.
Education improves human rights, and I was wondering how well educated the average person seems in
What was the part about civil rights?
education improves human rights, and how well educated are people?
Answer that next.
He wants to know how well educated the average citizen, I guess the person you meet on the street, seems.
Well, they're as educated as you and I here. I never went to college in the United States, and they are going on to college, but they're guaranteed education up to the 9th grade. So they're well-educated to that extent. There was a question I wanted you to.
Well, I just wanted to say about the money. When I was in Cuba, I speak Spanish, and I took a couple of days to circulate in Havana. And if you go to Cuba and you speak Spanish, or you have a translator, you can pretty much go wherever you want and talk to whoever you want.
They're eager to talk with you.
They're eager to talk, and they're eager to complain about a lot of things too. But one of the biggest complaints that you get from people is about this dual system. Because the dollars, they don't complain about socialism. They don't complain about Fidel, he's too old and he should leave office. They complain that the new situation in the world is such that they don't have any fair trade agreements anymore. They used to trade their sugar and their nickel and their products for other products on an equitable trading system when they had trading partners willing to do that. Now everything is cash, and cash is dollars. So everything on the island that comes from outside or is produced with machinery that they have to buy parts for from outside, everything has to do with dollars. So they're having this problem, and people are worried about where that's going to go. But so far, they're having constant discussions about it and allowing people to have their input into that discussion.
Was there a first part to your question that I didn't get through here?
Mine?
Yeah.
My question was just that I understand that education improves human rights,
Yeah.
and I was just wondering
What?
how well educated were the people in Cuba, and is it limited to who can go to these colleges and such? I was just trying to get a handle on it.
He's trying to get a handle on does education really free up individuals, and is higher education restricted to individuals in Cuba?
Not if they can pass the exams.
Yeah, I guess intellectual capability is a
They have
factor.
one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America, I think.
Way over there against the wall. Why is Cuba what? If so many other countries are investing in Cuba, why does then Cuba need the U.S.?
Because they've just begun. Last year in 1993, these countries were not trading with Cuba, and now they are defying the U.S. restrictions, and only now is the first year. That's why I say I feel a difference since 1993 to 1994, and maybe that Cuba will be able to continue to thumb the nose at the U.S. and will not be getting U.S. aid, but will be able to get along with European and Asian aid. Chinese bicycles are flooding the Cuban market. They had started a factory to make their own bicycles, and now there are lots of shining new Chinese bicycles there. The U.S. may find itself defeated in this measure. I hope it will.
Yes, ma'am.
Don, could you or Mike explain that some people maybe they don't understand about the Torricelli bill and how much that puts a penalty on other countries who do business?
Well, one example of that touches home here in Maine, that shows the hypocrisy of this Torricelli bill, is that there are jets that are flying to Cuba with tourists from Europe that go to Canada to refuel instead of Bangor Airport because the Torricelli bill denies landing rights to any plane or any ship or any vessel that's carrying anything for Cuba, to or from Cuba. So they have to go to Canada to refuel. Now, Bangor International Airport has asked for an exemption to the embargo, and rushing to the rescue are Bill Cohen and Olympia Snow, who have both adamantly opposed any changes in the Cuba policy until now. And what
Good business for Bangor.
Good business for Bangor. What we're suggesting is an exemption for the state of Maine. Why not open the thing up? Why should they get preferential treatment? Why can't everyone trade if there's trading to happen with Cuba? But this is they have this this law that if you stop in Cuba, if you have a boat come from, one of the ways this affects indirectly is that if you have a boat come from Europe with the majority of the cargo, they can't afford to fill up a boat with just cargo for Cuba. But if they stop in Cuba and unload 3 crates, they can't stop in the United States. It's prohibited, so,
The Torricelli bill.
Right.
bill.
So Cohen and Snow are now for having free access to Cuba from Bangor.
No, just that one exception.
just to refuel the jets.
The Torricelli bill includes in it a penalty for any country dealing with Cuba, and that is gradually eroding as we hear stories of these countries, China, Canada, are having enterprises in Cuba. Yes, way in the back.
Could you briefly comment a few words about your observations about what could be exported, transported here to Maine in terms of living a good life vis-a-vis Cuba? What could be learned from their experience that might help us here in our own situation?
What could we learn from the Cubans to bring here to us so that we could then, by learning from them, lead indeed the good life?
Do you get that? He's my cohort.
Did you see anything in Cuba that you think would be a good thing to bring to this country to enable us to live the good life?
There's a fearlessness there, and there's a strength of character somehow, and a cheer and a warmth, which I don't sense so much in America. I really feel that the Cubans have something quite special in their characters, whether it's due to being a small island, whether it's due to their socialism, whether it's due to their affection for Castro, whether it's because they're just younger brothers, but there's something very special. Go and see them, go and feel them, and for heaven's sakes, invite them to your homes.
Yes, sir.
Is there any examples you know of the U.S. penalizing or threatening European countries, Canada, or
You following through on the Torricelli bill, you mean?
that or anything else?
Yeah.
Business or trade or...
Do we know of any examples where the United States has followed through and penalized other countries?
Maybe they've just threatened them and haven't gone through with it yet. No, I don't know, but that's interesting. I'll follow up on that too. Thank you. I learn at every meeting.
Well, part of the Torricelli bill is actually illegal in most other countries because the Torricelli bill, I don't know how you pronounce that, Celli or Celli, but...
You should know, I speak Spanish.
He inserted legislation in there that says that if you're an American company's subsidiary in another country, that you have to follow the law of this country. And that's illegal in most other countries. I mean, England has issued a statement saying that companies doing business in England are going to follow their laws and not this law. And companies doing business in Canada are going to follow their laws. So it's really in conflict with international law. The entire embargo is in conflict with international law.
So it's really meaningless, basically, outside the country?
Outside the country, it's meaningless except that they have ways of applying pressure on these governments that don't restrict their trade.
But he asks if that has been enforced, and that's very interesting. I'll try and follow that.
What penalties?
I could just give an example of that. I believe the example was in Scandinavia. They were producing some high-tech medical equipment using nickel from Cuba in the mix that made the stainless steel. And because of that, those instruments were not allowed to be imported to the United States. That's just one small example, but it happens over and over. And so, of course, that restricts other countries from importing some of those resources.
There was an incident about 6 months ago of a ship had stopped in port there and unloaded rice or something, a Chinese or in that part of the world. But they were then restricted. They couldn't dock here in the United States. So it has happened. Yes, sir.
John, it has happened over and over again. It's true that countries are getting fed up with American interference in their trade, but it's been a very serious problem. Japan has been unable to send repair parts for X-ray machines that are used in pediatric hospitals in Cuba because there's a component in it that has an American patent. Cuba has to go halfway around the world to get roofing materials from China in a way that 3/4 of the money they pay goes into travel fees for those roofing materials. Every country that wants to deal with Cuba has to do it in a sub rosa manner so as not to suffer the consequences of American pressure. It is also true that some of those countries are now rebelling. Even one of the countries that supported the U.S. in the UN, Israel, is now a co-operator of the largest citrus field in the Caribbean. They had to keep that operation very secret from the U.S. until it got underway. In Holland, where they have had a lot of pressure from the U.S. forbidding them to engage in trade with Cuba, the Netherlands has now opened the first European-based commercial bank in Cuba. So resistance is piling up, but the Cubans have suffered grievously under the Torres-Sally Amendment. A physician that accompanied the Winthrop medical group to Cuba called me this week to please inform the group about the problem of lack of soap in Cuba. He visited pediatric hospitals. He informed me, by the way, that there are 10 medium-sized pediatric hospitals just in the city of Havana, not counting the large one.
The group that I went with to Cuba last time, we brought over medicaments and cosmetics and things of that kind of bags. And one woman had a bag this large, full of small hotel pieces of soap. She must have collected through the years. Tiny little bars of soap and a whole bag full. And of course, it was very useful there and a great treat. We just chuck them aside or leave them in the hotel. This woman collected a bag for Cuba.
One more question.
The soap store that Dr. Whitney of South Paris, Maine, called and asked me to share with. In one hospital in Havana, in one of the 10 medium-sized hospitals in Havana, there are 150 documented cases of esophageal stricture.
Don't ask me to repeat that. Severe damage
that has to be surgically repaired with tissue from the colon. Severe damage resulting from children ingesting the residue of homemade lye-based soap. Esophageal stricture there's not been a single case in Maine in the last 25 years. And there's 2 new cases each week at one pediatric hospital in Cuba. Maybe instead of refueling the airliners in Bangor, we could ask Bill Cohen to lift the embargo on soap.
We'll take one more question. We'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Helen you've been purporting back to basics, taking care of yourself, getting everything from the earth. What is the willingness of the people on the street that you've talked to for taking care of themselves, making soap from their earth, from their ingredients? If we should be bringing them something, shouldn't it be something so they can make their own foods or, things that are back to basics? I can't understand bringing them any capitalistic products like packaged soap.
How can we help to make them self-sustaining?
Yes.
You want to know if Helen has any ideas on how
the Cubans we could help the Cubans to become self-sustaining and not dependent on other countries.
Yeah, I brought that question up many times, and when we were out in the country, when we were in agricultural depots and places of that kind, I said, why instead of all this sugar, why this monocrop, why don't you have small independent gardens? And I said, a lone woman and an old woman can raise my own food, 65 to 70% of my own food in the garden. Why cannot the Cubans use their productive soil for that instead of these large monocrops? And they said they're working on it. I think they realize that they have specialized too much and that if they were self-subsistent, they could exist without this aid for many products from the USA. So it's, they're considering it.
So we're going to give you a break, and then you'll do some book signing, okay?
Yeah, tell them I'm signing any book.
Thank you, Helen Nearing. I think that Helen Nearing fully supports our motto, "Let Cuba Live," tonight. Helen will have a book signing in the parish house. We'll give her a few minutes to catch her breath, and we will set up in the next room, and you can come in.
Incidentally, I found just yesterday, a box of old leaflets giving the prices of books 4 or 5 years ago. And as you know, books have gone from $3 to $10 to $15 to $20. There are some even in the 30s. But this old list is being used today so that you can buy the books at the old prices, certainly $2 or $3 under. So I found that box yesterday, and you can benefit by it.
All right. While we're waiting for our setup in the next room, I'd like to introduce Margaret De Rivera. Margaret was on our second caravan. She was all set to go across the border at Laredo, and that was the caravan in which the hunger strike occurred. It wasn't planned that way, and she was immediately conscripted into the ranks of a support group that stayed behind through that nearly a month time, helping the people who were on strike. Margaret De Rivera.
Just a moment, and before you all leave, my job is to encourage you to pull out your wallets and your checkbooks and make out a check to Let Cuba Live, so that this important work of educating the American public and promoting some support for our friend to the south can continue, and I hope you'll do that. I'd like to just comment about that last question that was floated to Helen about what can we do that will help Cuba stand on its own feet and develop a sustainable future. I just came back from Cuba myself a few weeks ago, and I was looking at sustainable agriculture there. And I'm happy to report that partly as a result of the exigencies of this special period that they're experiencing right now, they are doing a very focused effort to develop alternative agricultural methods that will be a model for the rest of the world, and I think for us. They're really changing their agricultural techniques and their agricultural system radically in order to be able to pursue agriculture without pesticides and without chemical fertilizers in sustainable ways that I'm really envious of. And I saw many urban gardens in the cities of Havana and Santa Clara and Pinar del Rio, and people there are taking those matters into their own hands. They're also developing green medicine, plant medicines, because they can't get the high-tech medicines that we're used to here, and they're feeling powerful about doing that. But I would like to just encourage all of you to become involved in working for an end to the embargo for Cuba. I think it's time for us to make friends there. Let Cuba Live is a very young organization. It's only been going for less than 2 years. It started with the first friendshipment to Cuba in November of 1992, and they, Let Cuba Live has sent drivers, vehicles, and humanitarian aid on each of the 3 caravans in 1992, 93, and 94, and is preparing for the next one that's coming up in October and November of this year. We encourage any of you who might be interested to participate in that to sign up for that. Let Cuba Live has participated in the first Freedom to Travel Challenge, which was held last fall, and there will be another travel challenge coming up shortly. They have opened a Let Cuba Live travel office in Brunswick, Maine, and there is material out in the front lobby there which you can look through, and it tells you about how you can travel to Cuba either as a tourist or as someone who's interested in seeing what's happening there in terms of their system of society. Let Cuba Live has been sponsoring many speaking events about Cuba and the blockade and all the related topics that go with that. We've been meeting with Congressman Tom Andrews and have successfully encouraged him to co-sponsor the Rangel bill, which, if is enacted by Congress, will undo the blockade. And we have a few events coming up. We're going to be co-sponsoring with Yale University a conference on the ethics of U.S.-Cuba relations. That's coming up April 23rd. And then the 25th Venceremos Brigade on April 26th. One of our members is going on that one. And there's going to be a lobby day in Washington, D.C., June 9th. Many of you may be interested in joining that. I believe we'll have some buses going down there. The second travel ban, the Travel Challenge, is coming up June 23rd. We encourage people to sign up for that to challenge the travel ban. And then, as I mentioned before, the next friendshipment is coming up in October and November. So before you leave, please make your donations and take a look at the information out in the front lobby. And you may have noticed that there's a few t-shirts floating around like this. These are made by some of our people here, and we encourage you to take a look at those. They're out for sale, I believe, for $12. Anybody want to verify that? Out in the front lobby. Thank you very much for coming.
That ends our program. Thank you very much. We see a lot of new faces. A lot of you are Nearing people. Nearing has embraced our cause. You have embraced Nearing, and our cause is her cause, and we welcome you and hope that you will support us in the future. Look in the newspapers in the fine print. We don't get much publicity, but we're there every day. It's getting a little more, and there'll be demonstrations coming up, and we're going to test this bill, and we're going to test the embargo, and we're going to bring it down. We need help.
Good work.
Yeah,
Good job.
everybody, thank you. Hi.
Would you be able to point me to any of the Wilk people here? I just
To the which people?
The International League for People.
Yes.
I belong, but I don't know anyone
right,
around.
Lukey is... oh, yeah, where Lukey is at the... I think she's at the literature table.
Thank you very much.
Ask for a Lukey Lofty.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks for coming. I've seen you around before.
I'm Dick Bowman. If you could get these speakers to be trained and to articulate and how to use the last speaker could do that. She was the only really accomplished person. And you've got all the they're taking the time to learn how to articulate.
Dick Bowman, is your name?
Yeah, I've been at 28
I'll be sure to bring that up.
She's okay. She runs away.
Okay,
You know her.
I think I may have seen you also.
Yeah.
I'll be sure to pass that on. Thank you.
You know, the Quakers have 20 de Amigos, New England yearly meeting. We're the Cuban Quakers. And we had them over here at yearly meeting last year. It was in
a lot of
Amherst.
people are doing things. We should get together and increase our numbers. It could be impressive.
Well, I'll try and send it.
Fine, yeah.
The clerk of our yearly meeting is one who has gone to Cuba, who speaks Spanish. And so it's really an official activity of the yearly meeting. And they were there, and we actually had a discussion group last year.
Did you hear that?
With them in Spanish.
Oh.
And I was in.
I think any rational person, when he hears the argument, he just can't resist and say, well, it's wrong. Absolutely. How do you do?
The woman who spoke at the end.
You're right. She could articulate.
Heard and she was organized.
I'll pass that. I appreciate your comment. Thank you. They were supposed to be. I don't know.
I told you you'll be sitting on the paper, so I'm sister Yes, of course. What do you want? See you. I can't.
Okay, make sure I got it.
Well, one is oil and swivel, so one didn't. No, and it changed the height of that, but it wasn't. So I had to wait and then more.
It was a wonderful reading, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Can we get some of that stuff you just did?
Sure, I got this.
Did you? You know you.
I got this. I know. This is nailed.
Okay. Well, I want to get in touch.
Okay.
I know, I really had no idea. We went for the theater project, so it all